Good evening and welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman and I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is Ilya Shapiro, who is a senior fellow and director of constitutional studies at the Manhattan Institute. Previously, he was the executive director and senior lecturer at the Georgetown Center for the Constitution, and before that, vice president of the Cato Institute, director of its Robert A. Levy Center for Constitutional Studies, and publisher of the Cato Supreme Court Review. He's the author and co-author of various publications, contributor to a number of different well-known media and publications, and a well-known speaker on the topics of freedom of speech, constitutional issues, and he is himself no stranger to controversy. I'll let him tell you a little bit about it, but the reason he's here today is to discuss a controversial topic of the recent scandals involving academia. We've all heard of the resignation of the president of Harvard, Claudine Gay, and the plagiarism scandals, anti-Semitism allegations around her departure, and a lot the resignation of UPenn, head of UPenn as well. But there's a lot more to the story, and many people believe that the resignation of these figures, possibly figureheads, may not necessarily be the remedy to resolve all the controversies and all the academic fallouts that we have been seeing and the trends behind them. And that's why Ilya is with us today to discuss to what extent that's true. What are these scandals revealing about the state of the academia today, the state of the freedom of speech, the state of academic integrity, and what can we expect in the near future? Ilya, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. Before we begin, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your own experiences with both the academia itself and cancel culture and the controversies in that context?
Sure. Good to be with you. Like you, Irina, I was born in, well, I don't know where exactly you were born, but I was born in Moscow, Russia, and we immigrated when I was little to Canada. I grew up in Ontario and then came to the US for college and law school and have been in the DC area for about 20 years now. Working on constitutional law, writing, speaking, doing all these things that someone at a think tank does. And as a lawyer, I've also filed a lot of briefs in the Supreme Court. Most recently, after about 15 years at the Cato Institute, the nation's largest libertarian think tank, I thought, I should take my career in a slightly different direction, have a different kind of impact, and got hired to be the executive director of Georgetown Center for the Constitution. And a few days before I was due to start that job, I had a controversial tweet criticizing President Biden for limiting his Supreme Court pool by race and sex. I didn't phrase it in the best way, but regardless, a whole scandal broke, and I was investigated for that tweet, a so-called investigation that took 4 months. At the end of which they let me off on the technicality that I was not yet an employee when I tweeted, but otherwise the the instruction was there that I could not violate progressive orthodoxy, and so I quit very loudly and did a lot of media, and that was part of the last couple of years of critiques of American higher education for wokeness, for discrimination in viewpoint, for cracking down on freedom of speech, lots of different problems, intellectual corruption of various kinds, which crystallized for a lot of people, or a lot of people began to pay attention after October 7th, after the Hamas's attack on Israel, and the response, the weak response of many university officials, culminating in the congressional hearing last month, where the three university presidents of Harvard, Penn, and MIT appeared and gave a disastrous performance. Two of them, of course, have since resigned. And so that's why we're discussing what we're discussing. A lot of people that were not paying attention or kind of dismissed criticisms of higher education as being some right-wing propaganda or what have you, are now looking seriously at what kind of activities, programs, education students are getting at these institutions, and why there's been what I've characterized as an illiberal takeover of higher ed.
Now, there's been complaints about many of these issues for decades, since, maybe 9/11, or if not earlier, about the fact that the faculty is biased, that conservative or pro-Israel students are facing challenges both from the students and from the faculty, that the freedom of speech in elite institutions in particular is not welcomed. Harvard, in fact, is one of the lowest, if not the lowest ranking on the
Yeah,
freedom of speech index.
the foundation for individual rights and expression, FIRE, is kind of the gold standard for evaluating campus climate and freedom of speech, and Harvard is absolutely dead last. Penn and Georgetown are also in the bottom five, so a lot of these elite institutions really are failing on those metrics. Yes.
So why is it that these issues that have been percolating for decades are only coming to a head now? Is it October 7th that really brought this to a halt? And if so, why that particular issue and not many of the myriad scandals related to free speech that preceded it? Or is there something else in the water beyond this general climate of intolerance and liberal orthodoxy, or progressive, I should say, not illiberal?
What we're seeing, not just since October 7th, but really within the last decade or so, is something that's different than the decades-long complaint of the hippie takeover of the faculty lounge, going back to Berkeley in the 1960s or something like that. I graduated college 25 years ago. I graduated law school 20 years ago. I don't think the ideological ratio among either the student body or the faculty has changed all that much in that time. What has changed is the growth of the bureaucracy, such that there's now more non-teaching staff than faculty, than teaching faculty at most schools, and especially this is pronounced at the richer elite schools. They've been spending all that money on hiring more educrats, if you will, administrators. And at the same time, you have various cultural shifts with the advent of social media and smartphones. Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff have written about this, the social psychology of youth, mental health issues, and the growth of wokeness. Not simply people on the left, but people rejecting America's and higher education's classical liberal foundations, things like free speech and open inquiry, due process. These are all things, they say, in this illiberal critique that are symptomatic of illegitimate white supremacy or structures that undermine people's freedom based on their identity. And you have these postmodern theories that are being implemented first from the bureaucracy and the growth of DEI offices, about which we'll get to in a moment, and then also teaching by the faculty. If you do a search of Harvard courses, there are so many that talk about decolonization or social justice or things like this. Again, this is not, the left. This is the illiberal left that rejects the traditional concern for open inquiry and truth seeking and free speech. Remember, those Berkeley hippies in the 60s were demanding free speech against the stodginess, the conservative recalcitrance of that era's institutional leaders. Now it's something different. And so what we've seen with these cultural trends and how youth are acculturated and the incentives that they face with social media and things like this, the trans panic, for example, the social contagion in various things, and also the bureaucratization of higher education, which in the last 5 or 10 years has been almost exclusively in this DEI space. And so university leaders who themselves are not generally social justice warriors or woke radicals, they're generally career bureaucrats who have found a way to climb the greasy pole of university leadership. And so when they see an outrage mob, a cancellation mob, say, it's easier for them to placate that mob rather than to stand up to it. And most people have kind of just tried to keep their heads down and not get caught in the crossfire. Since October 7th, we've seen perhaps a change in this dynamic because people who are not otherwise politically engaged, neither the illiberal DEI style mob nor the conservative pushback, but kind of people in the middle, normal people, average people, whether on campus or especially off, are seeing that there's something wrong, that the response to October 7th, especially on campus, has been strange, has been attacking Israel. Even before Israel launched its invasion of Gaza to try to root out Hamas, there were anti-Israel protests, there were anti-Semitic protests, and people started thinking, why is this? What is so fundamentally wrong that the center of Hamas support in America is on university campuses and especially elite university campuses? And that led people to dig deeper and see the rot at the heart of these institutions, not just with cancel culture, not just with anti-Semitism, which as frequently in the history of humanity, anti-Semitism is the canary in the coal mine. It's the first indicator, but it shows that there is a much deeper problem going on. And so, for example, the Bill Ackmans of the world, the rich donors, the rich alumni, but it's, they get the publicity, but I think a lot of kind of average people who don't spend all of their time online or focusing on university politics or what have you are starting to notice that their alma mater is different than it was 20, 25 years ago.
No, as much as I agree with Bill Ackman that the problem goes, deep beyond the Claudine Gaze and any individuals at the helm of the institutions, many of whom are chosen to represent a particular message from the academia and are not necessarily answerable for every aspect of it in their own right. Something boggles my mind here. We've been hearing a lot of these excesses were self-evident long before the Hamas attack, simply because we've been hearing stories from harassed students who've sued some of these universities about foreign funding flowing into the schools, about the fact that Middle East studies departments were teaching that Osama bin Laden is a freedom fighter, and that was years before the current situation. We've been hearing about, basically self-hatred being propagated among white or I would say so-called white groups, because how they decide who is white and who isn't is itself a subject for a separate debate and and beyond the scope of the discussion. But whatever they decide is white supremacism or white identity. All of this, the egregious nature of some of these things has been ongoing for years. Nevertheless, Harvard and other elite schools continue to send their alumni into the media, into the NGO circles, into the policy and political circles. The donors, both Jewish and non-Jewish, have continued the flow of donations. The U.S. government, with some investigative exceptions, continues funding these institutions. Yes, the Supreme Court ruled about the affirmative action, but that's the Supreme Court. I'm talking about the Department of Education and the like. And in general, there has been no effort up until this point to divest from organizations, whether it's the corporations behind these universities or whatnot, that propagated bigotry and that propagated bigotry, whether it's against Asians, against Jews, against whoever, but both on identity based and ideological basis. So the question is, why would we think that anything will change with a small outrage by a small number of Jewish donors now, when these universities accumulated huge endowments, when they continue remaining at the top by the number of faculty, research, and the types of selectiveness of the students, despite many shortcomings. And I'll get to other non-ideological shortcomings in a moment.
Well, I don't think it's just about Jewish donors. I think it's external actors of various kinds. Because higher education, whatever was wrong with it, and I think so many things that are wrong with higher ed were sort of combined in this episode with Claudine Gay, whether it's intellectual corruption, whether it's DEI, whether it's affirmative action, whether it's bureaucratization, because I think she's more of a case study of the bureaucratization of higher ed than even affirmative action. But leaving that aside, that's, higher ed was never going to reform itself because it's basically an echo chamber. And so it would always take exogenous shocks to right the course. And by exogenous shocks, that's a kind of an economic term, but it means outside stakeholders, whether it's alumni, donors, trustees, or pressure on trustees, state legislators, federal judges, some of whom, a year ago announced that they would not be hiring clerks from Yale and Stanford until they got better at speech protections. Employers, right? A lot of big employers said they won't hire students who signed statements supporting Hamas, this sort of thing. So it was always going to take external stakeholders, which I think is a healthy development because universities, especially elite universities, are important institutions and influential institutions whose faculty, whose presidents, what they say has an impact on the public discourse. But it took something so shocking, such an inflection point as October 7th, to have this broader impact. And we're still in the middle of it. It's unclear whether indeed anything will change long term. And I agree, as you said, and as I've written, removing Claudine Gay or Liz McGill, the president of Penn, doesn't solve the problem because the problems are structural, whatever the weaknesses or incompetencies or what have you, negligence of any individual. There are structures and systems in place purposely that were put in place over years that need to be dismantled for these things to be fixed. And there's one issue with the bureaucratic side, and then there's the issue of what's actually taught, what kind of faculty are hired, what courses are offered. So it's not an overnight solution where, a bunch of billionaires, Jewish or otherwise, get together and say, okay, we're not making donations for a few years. It's a much deeper thing where it's not about adding a course on anti-Semitism to the law school. It's about changing the whole ethos, reorienting it back to being a center of open inquiry and education, rather than having a narrow Overton window of permissible policy views that just indoctrinates and churns out activists.
To what extent would that even be possible, given the fact that this broader academic culture of conformity and intellectual dishonesty and basically self-censorship has been perpetuated for decades? Are there any faculties who would even be eligible for this new reorientation should someone decide that this is something worth doing?
Well, at public institutions, there's oversight from state actors. Florida and Texas and a few others have legislated to disestablish, to abolish their DEI structures, for example, as well as looking hard at what kind of departments and what kind of course offerings should be. Not controlling what faculty say in the classroom. That's a separate issue of speech and academic freedom. But if taxpayers are going to be providing these services, then clearly there should be state oversight. And at the for private institutions, including the Harvards of the world, there can be congressional oversight, right? The reason we're talking about this is not just October 7th, but that hearing 2 months later, where Congress was trying to understand why there's so much anti-Semitism on campus. And it's not just a matter of politicians grandstanding or having hearings where they're asking university officials questions. There's also federal funding, and that can be withheld or restricted. There can be new strings tied to it. It's not that federal research funds or student loan funds are given, as a blank check. There are all sorts of strings attached already. The schools have to maintain accounting standards, for example, to minimize fraud. They're not allowed to discriminate. Congress is looking at adding speech strings, protections for freedom of speech and due process, anti-Semitism as well. You mentioned the Department of Education. On paper, the Department of Education has opened investigations, and the way that they've interpreted Title VI, that's the responsibility of institutions that receive federal funds to maintain equal access to educational opportunities, regardless of various characteristics, which have been interpreted to include ethnic background and religious background. There are levers of power and influence that are already there if they're used in a proper manner. Now, this is not going to be an overnight change. It took decades to get to where we are now. And again, some problems started literally within the last decade, the growth of these DEI structures. Others are decades long, discrimination against faculty applicants who are politically incorrect, and things like this. Others have legal solutions. The Supreme Court ruled to outlaw racial preferences in admissions. That's still going to be litigated. That's not an overnight thing, as these schools are resisting that. So there are different issues here. It's not just one a simple issue, and there are different cultural, legislated, enforcement solutions that need to be affected on multiple levels. And so I don't know. I'm optimistic about some things. I'm pessimistic about others. But the landscape has definitely shifted from when I resigned from Georgetown a year and a half ago.
And that brings me to a point of non-ideological factors, which nevertheless are just as important. The issue that you spoke with, which is intellectual corruption. We are seeing markings of it both in publications about Harvard's and Yale's and other universities' inflation of grades, and in the plagiarism scandal involving not only Claudine Gay, but now apparently other individuals who've come under scrutiny. So the question is, how did these elite universities, who were at the top of telling everyone to believe in science, to believe in process, have been, hiding behind all these scandals? And I am hearing from various academic groups about the shortcuts being taken for the purpose of funding for research in scientific research, which could essentially be dangerous if they're cutting corners on experimentation and scientific method. This means that we're not getting necessarily the right outcomes, the right the confirmation of these studies. We're getting wishful thinking that's getting funded and that may cost lives. So how did this greed and corruption of these institutions become so entrenched and yet so widely accepted? It's almost as if it's a rite of passage. People don't care if you come out with fewer skills and with more intellectual dishonesty and corruption and lack of ethics going through this university, as long as you get the credentials that will get you a top level jobs. Where is this credentialism coming from?
A lot of it is public policy incentives. So a lot of jobs require a college degree. For example, in DC, to work at a daycare, you need a college degree, which is ridiculous. The student loan machine industry encourages schools to take on more students, regardless of whether they're getting educated in things that are can allow them to make a living, but as well as increasing their tuition at the same rate as the student loans are being increased. With scientific research, I don't know as much about it because I'm a constitutional lawyer, but my understanding is so much of the research is federally funded, and so you have an incentive to come up with results that track what you think the government wants to get out of them. I think that's partly behind the scandal with Stanford's president, who resigned last year, before, nothing to do with October 7th, but he was a scientist and falsified data and all sorts of related allegations. He's a white man, by the way, nothing, nothing racial about any of these things, nothing, just like plagiarism. So you're right. I think for too long, academics, both the administrators and faculties, have operated without any scrutiny. And so that they've grown a sense of entitlement. They've also, the way that universities have run themselves, it's kind of a cartel in the sense that it's hard to get a full tenured position, but once you're in, and it's like the best job in the world. You can't be fired, you don't work that much, you get paid a lot, and a lot of the actual teaching is done by adjuncts or others without protections who don't get paid a lot, and that's to the detriment of the students as well. And then when you're looking at students as the consumers, then there's pressures to give them all easy A's. The average grade at Harvard last year was an A, the average grade. So there's no such thing anymore as a gentleman's C. 50 years ago, it was just, anyone that showed up would kind of get a C, because that's, how gentlemen treated each other. Well, we've liberalized now, and it's not just gentlemen, there are ladies, and it's a lot of different backgrounds. And so now you just get a gentle person's A, I guess, is the thing that you go along to get along. So yeah, there are a lot of misaligned incentives there. And I hope that one of the byproducts of this scrutiny of higher ed now, again, started with anti-Semitism, but is starting to reveal more and more layers of dysfunction and rot that, as you said, have nothing to do with any sort of ideological critiques.
And that brings me to the simple issue of money and power, because at the end of the day, power relies on self-perpetuation and in closing doors to disruptors of any kind, whether it's on ideological basis, ethnic basis, class basis, whatever the case may be at any given point in time. We have seen periods of time when power protected itself sometimes by completely illegal now and unethical methods, and lack of transparency is one lever of perpetuating power and perpetuating these money making machines. And one of the issues that has emerged from these scandals after Gates' resignation is Harvard Corporation, which I'm sure is, not too dissimilar from many other, corporations behind these institutions. To this day, nobody really knows the process by which these people are elected, or how they choose their own successors and designated individuals like Claudine Gay. So what, if anything, can be done to disrupt this process? Who is going to be making a demand? What incentives is there for people who have been part of this power structure for hundreds of years, not just decades at this point, and who have nothing to fear and who are not in any who has the power over them?
Right. Well, one of the byproducts of the Claudine Gay scandal is to throw attention to the Harvard Corporation, which is a fancy name for the Board of Trustees. And there are only 12 of them, which is unusual. I went to Princeton, and Princeton has something like 45 or 50 trustees, which is a little high. Most boards are smaller, but anyway, Harvard has 12. Other schools have, different amounts, but it's typically wealthy donors or prominent alumni. One of the members of the Harvard Corporation, the board, is a former president of Princeton. The chairwoman is Penny Pritzker, part of the wealthy Pritzker family. The governor of Illinois is part of that family, and things like this. So yes, it's a very kind of incestuous, well-connected board like that. Then there's the Board of Overseers at Harvard, which is larger. I'm not sure exactly what the corporate governance relationship is, but you put your finger on it with the lack of transparency and accountability. Now, Harvard is not directly accountable to the American people, other than in how it spends federal funds, and that's why, hopefully, Congress and the Department of Education and others will be more, scrutinizing how these institutions that use federal funds use them, let alone at the state level when there are public schools, where the issues are somewhat different, in that the trustees aren't so much kind of establishmentarian elites as they're prominent local alumni who just want to be on the board for its prestige and to get good basketball and football tickets. And so they just defer to whatever the management, whatever the president, provost, deans, department chairs, whatever they tell them. And they just have kind of these rose-eyed glasses of nostalgia from when they were students and rah alma mater. You get a bit of that in the Ivies as well. Everyone thinks back to their glory days and how, everything's just hunky-dory and always going to be the same, and they trust the university officials. It's always easier just to, go up to the alma mater for a nice weekend and enjoy the song and dance and the student a cappella groups and whatever, rather than do the hard work of digging into whether it be the financials, the ideological structures, plagiarism, or anything else that might be going on that might need oversight. So I think one thing that will come out of this moment, I think, is more active trustee bodies or more scrutiny of trustee bodies to make sure that they are doing their jobs of oversight. At this point, I should disclose that I am now a member of a board of trustees. Governor DeSantis in October appointed me to the board of Florida Polytechnic University, which is a new school. It's about a decade old, and it focuses on STEM. So we don't really have the DEI issues. We have other issues with a new school that's growing very rapidly. I'm confident that in about another decade that it'll have a national reputation. And the idea is to compete with the Georgia Tech, MITs of the world.
Interesting. I think the more competition in general, the better it is for everyone, as I'm a very strong believer in this sort of incentive to try to get better when you're seeing alternative different models of education or policy or anything else. But that brings me to this question of competition and this question of bureaucratization. Claudine Gay, in her essay following her resignation, alleged that the backlash against her was all about conservatives unable to accept a Black woman, in a position of power. She made it all about identity politics. But quite frankly, I find all of this ironic because she is not a typical person that you would think of as representing this whole DEI debate, or at least its alleged stated goals. This is someone who came from a very privileged family from Haiti. She's not an African American born in some Chicago, urban area from a completely dysfunctional community and so on and so forth. This is someone who even after resigning maintains her full presidential salary, quite unusual, despite the fact that there's a clear wrongdoing as the cause of her resignation. She maintains this whole salary. This is not privilege. I don't know what is. So the question is, this sort of redefinition of these goals of DEI, these goals of all these motivations, this whole re-envisioning this legacy and what that means, not bringing in the, and this is someone who actually stole intellectual property from other Black scholars. So this is not really, the scandal is just as interracial as it is intraracial as it is, whether or not the conservatives targeted her because of her skin color. Because, by the way, the UPenn president was white and was forced to resign anyway, with far fewer issues to her. To my knowledge, at least she hasn't been involved in anything plagiarism related. So the question is, how is it that these institutions get away with allegations that actually hurt the groups that they're trying to help? Because for every Claudine Gay, there's a Black scholar with a genuine record of scholarship who does not get a chance to end up in that position because of people like her.
And even more than that, I mean, she investigated, persecuted, shut down the research lab of a brilliant young Black economist, Roland Fryer, who's now affiliated with the Manhattan Institute, where I work as well. He produced empirical work on policing that contradicted the progressive narrative, and she went after him on a pretextual case. Ronald Sullivan as well was stripped of responsibilities over, I think, one of the residential houses at Harvard because he represented Harvey Weinstein, and that was politically incorrect. He's a Black law professor, and Gay herself, has a scant academic record, but even more than her selection being for identity reasons, racial, gender, whatever preferences. She made her name by implementing DEI structures and systems as Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. That was who they were looking for. There was a DEI screen when the Harvard Corporation was looking for its next president. Not just the demographic box checking, but what have you done to advance DEI and anti-racism in the Ibram Kendi sense of you have to be racist to combat racism sort of thing. I think she's the apotheosis of an anti-intellectual movement that values identity and activism over truth-seeking, merit, and education. And so that's why the Harvard Corporation, the Board of Trustees, was in such a pickle. To admit that Gay was not qualified or was corrupt is to impugn themselves and their own search for president just a year ago. Now, her cries of racism really do ring hollow because of Liz McGill, because of the Stanford president, whom I mentioned. If now there's going to be, independent journalists reviewing the academic scholarship of all university presidents and senior faculty, I mean, that's great. I don't know who's objecting to that. That can only help the cause of turning higher ed back in the right direction. But there's just so much there with this example, and as you said, it's not just about Claudine Gay. It's about the corruption of higher ed much more broadly, and the illiberal takeover of academia. Again, I want to stress this. This is not just the latest in, decades of complaints by conservatives. This is something different where even the university's traditional mission of seeking knowledge and research and truth, that is being subverted in favor of this, postmodern theory of viewing everything through identitarian lenses and privilege hierarchies, intersectional contests, and so forth.
Now, after the Supreme Court struck down affirmative action, I'm hearing of two trends, which in some sense are no less disturbing than affirmative action at its worst. Which is first that reorienting directly from the identitarian quota system, which these universities used to implement. Now there is an effort to discuss it through the lens of grievances and adversity, and basically looking who's had the most grievances, to the point that some of the student applicants actually fabricate stories in order to pass muster. The other trend, and I'm curious whether I'm asking whether you've heard of any potential legal action or whether you think there's a potential for legal action over this criteria. Whether given that on the one hand, it's not, strictly speaking, subject to strict scrutiny, but on the other hand, if it lends itself to so much for potential fabrication, doesn't it violate the rights of students? And the other question is very much strict scrutiny related, which is that there's been an informal, I've been hearing rumors in the media that there's an informal consensus in Harvard to impose an informal quota on Jewish applicants. I'm not sure how accurate that is and whether you can comment on that.
Yeah, well, even before the last few months, people have been making parallels between the anti-Jewish quotas of the 20s and 30s in the Ivy League and what's going on now, because of course it's a zero-sum game. There's only a certain number of spots, and if you're looking to increase the percentage of a particular group, then other groups will go down. And I think that the Jewish percentages across the Ivy League have indeed been going down. As far as future litigation, I mean, certainly, just like Brown versus Board of Education, we're coming up on the 70th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education, which ruled against segregation in K-12 education, but it took a long time for that change to happen on the ground. More court rulings, as well as President Eisenhower and Kennedy sending in troops to these universities, or to schools. And a similar thing is going to happen here. More litigation. It's going to take a while to figure out. It's going to be discovery intensive, fact intensive, to find out exactly how the admissions departments do their job. Presumably, they're going to try not to create a paper trail. It's going to be messy. And this, some schools are going to try to focus on geographic diversity and look to zip codes that are heavily skewed towards particular racial groups. Others, as you said, are going to look at these new student statements. They're not going to be diversity statements. They're going to be adversity statements, and put more weight on those if students self-identify as a particular race. At the end of the day, if 10 years from now, the percentages of admittees by racial group don't change from when the Supreme Court ruled, that's going to be pretty strong evidence that that the schools did, that any particular school did, because they're not all adopting the same policies, that they're doing what the Supreme Court said they can't, which is to use pretextual factors to maintain the same sort of system. They can't even use these statements or responses to personal essays to maintain the same percentages. So yeah, there's going to be lots of litigation, and there's going to be lots of scrutiny about how the different schools do these things. If they want to just have more outreach, that's perfectly legal, of course. Some schools are now also getting rid of their legacy preferences or athlete preferences. Nothing wrong with that. Very few people are going to be opposed to that kind of policy. But it's, this is just one more thing that that higher ed officials are going to have to answer to, now that there's more attention, not just in public schools, but in private schools as well, about about how they're doing their jobs and what students are actually getting for their, tens of thousands of dollars of annual tuition fees.
And that brings us right back to the main issue, which is free speech, and where do we draw the line between academic freedom, for express your political sentiments, and protection from discrimination and harassment? Because a lot of there's several ongoing lawsuits by Jewish students claiming that the universities at the peak of this mob activism on campus have failed to protect the students and have failed in their duty to provide protection from harassment and discrimination. But on the other hand, there's the choir claiming that banning support for Hamas or support for October 7th on campus violates free speech protection. So where do we draw the lines in this debate?
I've written about this. I had a piece in the Free Press at the end of November about where free speech ends and something else begins. And there's basically three buckets that you have to look at. First of all is activity that's just not speech. So assault or vandalism. This is not, even if you're doing it with a political motive, that is not protected. Or as I saw one article where somebody urinated on a building to express disapproval of the organization in the building. I'm sorry, you're not going to get out of a public urination law just by saying that you're being expressive in doing this. Similar with graffiti or again, assaulting people, blocking them, stalking people. This does not, these are criminal laws. Whatever your motive is, you're not going to get First Amendment free speech protections. And most schools' speech policies parallel First Amendment protection. The second category is exceptions to speech protection. So if you're making what courts call a true threat of death or physical harm against someone, that's not protected. If you are inciting violence, that's not protected. Now, this is a high bar in the jurisprudence. Just saying, from the river to the sea, that's not called incitement of violence. Now, if someone is having a rally and they're saying from the river to the sea, and therefore, anytime you see a Jew today, punch them in the face. At that point, that's not protected. So there's the line drawing issues there. Or for that matter, this has come up in the university president's testimony, harassment, or the crime of menacing, if you're intimidating someone, if you have a type of rally and you're targeting it at the Hillel or something like that, or a dorm where there's a lot of Jewish students, that can violate rules against harassment, or what has been in the education laws known as a hostile educational environment, which goes back to Title VI and schools' responsibilities for maintaining equal educational opportunity. And then the third bucket is time, place, and manner regulations. So even core political speech can be regulated. You can't block traffic. We're hearing lots of this where all of these people who blockade should just be arrested because, again, it doesn't matter what your motive is. If you're doing things that are interfering with other human activities, then that can be regulated. Or I can't go to your neighborhood in the middle of the night and with a bullhorn tell everyone what I think of Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Even though that's core political speech, there are rules against disturbing the peace and things like this. So similarly, you can't interfere on college campuses with classes going on, if somebody's booked a space and a speaker, you can't disrupt that. If somebody's studying in the library, you can't. So there are rules like that, time, place, and manner regulations that if you're saying those same things in a public park, perfectly fine, or legal rather, not fine, but legal. So though there's a nuanced architecture there, but even if the university presidents had said all that at the hearing, they still would have failed because what they were asked was, is it okay to have chants for genocide? Not whether it's legal, not what the Supreme Court standard for incitement is. What they should have said is it's never okay and against our values to call for genocide against anyone. That should have been the first statement. But again, they didn't say that, and that exposed how they're just not good leaders to promote their own brands or higher education more broadly. And Irina, some of them are learning the wrong lesson from that hearing. That is, initially, President Liz McGill, before she resigned, the Penn president, said that, well, I've thought about it and I've realized that the problem is we've hewed our policies too closely to the First Amendment. We need less speech protection. No, that is not the issue. The issue is enforce your rules against disruption, against time, place, and manner regulations, harassment, all of these different things. You can disestablish Students for Justice in Palestine if, as seems to be credibly alleged, they've given material support to terrorist organizations, what the Supreme Court has said is okay to criminalize or to disestablish or to take negative actions against. So the lesson to learn isn't that, oh, we need to add Jewish people to the protected categories in DEI, or we need to restrict speech that calls for harming Jews. No, the answer is to apply those rules even-handedly and to understand that these ideologies that treat people differently based on whether they're put in the right bucket of oppressor, oppressed, or privilege, or what have you, that's not the right way to think about human relations.
Interestingly enough, when you that particular question that led to this whole to this entire explosion of commentary and led to the contributed to the resignation of these presidents by at least Stefanik. It was prepped by lawyers who were a well-known PR and legal firm that was preparing all of these people, all of these presidents for congressional inquiry. Needless to say, a question about support for genocide or rhetoric about concerning genocide was a very predictable sort of question. So there's been since then many speculations about whether they've actually taken the advice of these lawyers, whether they've simply gotten bad advice, and to what extent is support for genocide or for a terrorist organization in rhetoric, to what extent, where does it stand legally versus, of course, expressing sympathy for the students and coming across as heartfelt and all that. So the question of course, what they should have said in terms of common sense and NPR is one thing, but the question is, where do we stand in terms of support for terrorism, support for genocide? Where do we draw the line between this material support that seems to be part of the information warfare tactic by foreign entities, and somebody's disagreement with the way Israel is handling Gaza, or the two-state solution? That was also a missed opportunity, and I'm curious how the law firm should have advised their clients.
Well, I'm not sure it was the law firm. Well, Wilmer Hale, which by the way was advising Georgetown on my investigation as well, and I think blew it from a PR perspective there too. But I'm not sure it was necessarily the lawyers. I think the clients sometimes are the ones who are, they have to think on their feet, and they live in their little bubbles, and they never face questioning, and they never meet a Republican probably in their day-to-day lives. And so I'm sure the lawyers coached them. You could hear that in some of the answers about the genocide. Well, it depends on the context. That's a very legalistic answer, that I gave you just now. And they just displayed a failure of leadership, a failure of moral leadership, and not saying, well, of course we condemn such calls. If it's someone in their dorm room just doing something or writing it on their blog or something, that's one thing. But if they're harassing people, that's another. And there's a difference between what's legal and what's appropriate and what should be criticized. And again, if someone wants to stand in the middle of campus and say death to Jews, well, I think that person is an idiot and deserves criticism. But if they're not, harassing a particular person, or they're not directing their rally against the Hillel or something like that, then the most that can be done to them is just to criticize them. The problem is so much has gone beyond that. And for that matter, a lot of these protesters have been masked, and there are rules against masking as well, going back to the anti-KKK laws of a century ago. So a lot of complicated issues there. But again, just chanting for death to a group of people is not per se illegal. Doesn't necessarily violate school rules. But those things very quickly become harassment or intimidation, especially on a small enclosed campus.
And that finally brings me to a final point in all of this, among many, which is conflict of interest, which is many of the students who were involved in all these mob activities are foreign students, and some of the universities expressed reluctance to expel them or to hold them accountable because that would compromise the visas and therefore, by extension, cost the funding that is paid upfront by these foreign students and makes them eligible for spots that many Americans cannot get in because they don't come from wealthy families and have to take on loans to pay for them or their scholarship students or whatever. So clearly there's a financial incentive for these universities to turn a blind eye to outright illegal activity. At what point should the academic freedom be deprioritized concerning public safety and the government stepping in and taking action against anyone who is outright engaged in this sort of incitement?
Well, MIT has made the most news for not taking disciplinary action against students, even after they've been warned from violating school rules. And not anything that's on this gray area of is it just speech or is it, here they were blocking entrance to university buildings and otherwise, were warned that this violates our rules, and then they weren't disciplined precisely because they were foreign students. The MIT president, who's the third one, the last woman standing after that hearing last month, may still have to answer for that because, in effect, the foreign students now have more rights than the American students who would be disciplined. This is not a case where even our laws need to be amended so that we're not giving visas to anti-Semites or something like this. This is, the laws are clear there, and the State Department, in a response to a letter from Senator Marco Rubio of Florida, affirmed that these activities would subject these students to visa revocation. So these schools that are ignoring that because they don't want their students, to lose their visas, I think their general counsels need to be more proactive because doing things like that subjects them to liability under Title VI because they're then aware of actions being taken to deny educational opportunities, and they're not doing anything about it.
What I find ironic about this whole situation um is the fact that all this culture of conformity that and self-censorship and trying to appease this orthodoxy on campus, it's supposed to be the safe thing to do. It's supposed to keep everyone on the same page, but in reality, it goes hand in hand with the rise in radicalization, extremism, and outright illegal activity. So it's funny that on the one hand, these universities claim to be the proponents of intellectual, nonconformism and academic freedom, and all they claim that, there's a lot of self-backpacking about, this, transgender or other, sub-minority,
Yeah,
self-expression, being so radical.
they want lots of different identities and people who look very different that all think the same way. Yeah.
Yeah. So on the one hand, there's a sort of it's almost like this conformism and radicalization. They've kind of switched places because it's almost now the more radical you are, the more you actually conform. Um,
Yeah, I have nothing to say to that. That's
yeah, so
it's
how,
well, and it's not, and students aren't being educated because if the idea is you shouldn't be made to feel uncomfortable or encounter ideas that offend you, then you can't be educated. Then they're just being reinforced in your preconceptions, and that's not. It's obviously not good for the individual students, but it's not good for society. Particularly, I'm writing a book about this for law schools, the future leaders of our legal and political institutions. If they never encounter an idea that they disagree with or they don't like, they're not going to be able to advocate very well, and eventually they're going to blow up the law and on all of our structures because those don't reflect whatever orthodoxy they've been taught to conform to.
Or they get displaced by AI, whichever comes first. Not to end on a pessimistic note, but where do you see the disruption to all of this that we have seen? You mentioned the Florida initiative to establish a new STEM-oriented institution that will be competitive. Do you see any other kind of disruptive pro-free speech and anti-conformity initiatives that are positive in nature, not just and don't just involve investigating institutions for various violations?
Well, a lot of schools, typically flagship state schools, have started centers within them to that are doing or that are intended to do what universities were supposed to do in the first place. UNC, University of South Carolina, I think, University of Florida. There are a number of schools that have started these centers. Arizona State, I'm speaking at their center next month. So kind of schools within schools that are rigorous and intellectually diverse and all of those good things, and teach civics. Then there's independent institutions. The University of Austin that's starting up. I think this fall they're bringing in their first batch of students. Standalone new institutions or takeovers of existing ones. In Florida, my school, Florida Polytechnic, isn't a takeover situation. It's kind of building from the ground up and having an example of excellence. But New College, which is the liberal arts college that got a lot of attention when my colleague Chris Rufo was put on the board of trustees, as well as other notable conservatives. That's changing, radically changing the culture of the school by taking over the board of trustees. That's another strategy. And then there's just kind of bypassing these systems and employers realizing, there's a meme going around, right? That well, here's on your resume, it doesn't say where you went to school. Is that because you went to Harvard, right? So that's kind of a demerit, that the grades aren't worth anything because everybody gets A's. It's all plagiarism. It's all identity this. It's all, indoctrination, what have you. So it doesn't really mean much. Eventually the market responds to these things. And even if higher ed is an echo chamber that's going to be awfully hard to reform, the real world does respond to things. And so you've seen whether it's cancel culture or DEI or some of these other illiberal effects of the last several years, you've seen pushback and changes in the corporate sector, Bud Light response, just because when the average person sees some of these things, they see the ridiculousness for what it is.
Well, thank you very much. This was really enlightening, and I hope our audience gained a lot of insight into things that are messy and complicated. And I know there's a lot in the media and hard to keep up with it all, but I think we just had a pretty good breakdown of the main issues here. Thank you, Ilya, for joining us. For everyone who's watching, thanks again for tuning in. Please stay tuned for our next program, Tuesday night at 9 p.m. as usual. And have a